Welcome to episode 2 of the Roundtable podcast. My co-host today will be Sir Prize, my good friend, American Naval Intelligence and excellent Knight of the Roundtable, and my best friend, Duros/Trigger, who's Canadian Public Affairs. So I thought this would be interesting because you got Canadian naval guy, American naval guy, and we can just discuss geopolitics or politics or whatever you guys want, but it's pretty much open. So why don't we start by asking Duros or Trigger? What should I call you, Duros or Trigger?
Duros is fine.
All right.
Whatever's easier to say.
Duros. So what's the word? How's life in the Canadian Navy?
Life in the Canadian Navy is pretty good. We still are really lacking basic things. As a country and with a navy, so Trump is probably not wrong to be putting the screws on us to up our game that way. And overall, though, I think there's more money coming in than there's been in a long time, and more investment and more sort of taking it seriously. So overall, I think we're doing okay. I'm pretty happy with things.
How about you, Sir Prize? How's life in the American Navy Association?
I mean, nothing remarkable. We are getting a whole bunch of shit. Pay rises. Well, I mean, this is more for active, because that's how I think of when people ask me about it, even though I'm not active. Well staffed. Building a bunch of new hulls. 3% pay rise across the board. Trying to figure out the China thing, but we can get into that later. That's kind of what I geek out on, is the geopolitical and strategic aspects of it. But other than that, it's a job. Wait, what?
No, my bad. Just a reminder, if you're new to this podcast, check out the Roundtable Discord server. Just search Conspiracy Theory server on Discord, go to Roundtable, get in on the conversation. So that being said, what do you guys think about the geopolitical situation from the American and Canadian naval perspective? Let's start with Duros. What's it look like? Is Putin our main political adversary? Is Canada in any threat? What's the likelihood of a hot conflict? I mean, what's the vibe?
Well, Canada can't project power in any major way. We have sort of enough vessels to partially deal with our coast, assuming like the Russians don't come through the Arctic in force, in which case we just sort of have to trust the Americans to protect us. Canada's not going to start a hot conflict, so if the Americans start one, we'd be dragged into it, because that's how it works. But there doesn't seem to be any high chance of one happening in the near future. The whole thing with Iran, obviously Canada is a little bit furious about that, but again, there's nothing we could really do to a country like Iran. It was sort of how we got in that fight with Saudi Arabia, because both countries knew we could sort of yell at each other without it actually resulting in anything, because we don't do much trade or really interact or have any way to really interact. Canada's our main conflicts in the near future is gonna be kind of the Russians pushing into the Arctic, trying to sort of just kind of push us out and show that they claim it more than we do. So we are trying to invest in some more icebreakers and things so that we can somewhat maintain our position there and show that we're not totally reliant on the Americans up there. And then there's the Chinese, who are kind of hilariously calling themselves a near Arctic nation, even though they're not actually very close to the Arctic, but they sort of like to argue that they should have a major say in what goes on up there, because there's a lot of resources, a lot of oil resources, as the ice melts and pushes back. So it's becoming more interesting to everyone. So it'll be interesting. Canada might make the investments to defend our stake up there, or we might just rely on the Americans. I'm not really sure.
Thank you. And how about you, Sir Prize? What do you think about the naval situation? Like, if you're on the ship or in the base, what do the naval people feel? Like, is there any hot conflict developing? They're feeling pretty complacent?
A lot of people just kind of do their job, try to maintain maximum readiness. I do like that he brought up China's claims on the Arctic, which is laughable. The Arctic should be a Russo-American condominium. Sorry, Canada. But yeah, China has no place. But most people realize, I think, as is the foreign policy and defense establishment, of this country slowly starting to realize that China is the main threat. The Navy is going to have the principal role in trying to contain it. We keep getting distracted by absolute horseshit in the Middle East. I know a lot of people who had their assholes puckered when that happened, or at least like me were rolling their eyes, like, yeah, this isn't the war we want to fight. But yeah, everything is pretty much. If they talk about, so the more, how would I put it? Trying to think of the word, not intellectual, but the people that busy their minds with this kind of thing, everyone is in agreement that the People's Liberation Army Navy is, if we ever get into a major war, that's the main threat. Nobody talks about Russia, by the way. Just to your first question, like no one sees Russia. It's all everyone focuses on Beijing and the South China Sea and the first island chain, and being very cognizant of not being pushed out beyond that. And yeah, I'll stop there. But that's the general overview.
So let's get into this, and you guys can decide how comfortable you are about talking about any of this information. But you both work in different departments of the naval affairs, so you confirmed, Duros, that you work for public affairs. So what's that like? What's the agenda? What can you tell us about that kind of work in terms of public affairs for the Navy? What is that? What is the agenda? What's the target? What's the goal?
Well, I'll be honest. My role is the boring one. Like we're called the white hats of public affairs, meaning we're basically required to tell the complete truth of what we're allowed to say. We're not allowed to do fun spin to try and build strategic advantage by misleading people or things like that. It's sort of the public affairs branch. It sort of relies on the fact that if we mislead people in any way, then we totally lose all credibility. So we're sort of the official reporters for the Canadian military, which means we don't get to have the fun. Like there are various roles, kind of the black ops, like the counter intel people who do get to go into other countries and try and make up fun rumors about Russia or things like that. But that's not my role. So as far as things go, we mostly report to the Canadian public, except when there's missions going on, and there are some, like in Latvia along the Russian border. In which case, most of the job there, I'm not over there. I haven't been deployed there, so I'm speaking for other people. But it'd be their job, because the Russians are quite good at propaganda, and they'll, if any little event happens where a Canadian soldier does something dumb in another country, they'll, the Russian news stations will start playing it into their neighboring countries like Latvia and Estonia, and try and spin it. So a big part of the public affairs role is trying to counter spin. And as Bryce was saying there, people aren't really afraid of the Russians too much, being the big geopolitical enemy. Their economy is collapsing over time. They're sort of just like a dinosaur that's kind of flailing around a little bit, but they've taken such poor care of their economic circumstances that they have a big military. Their politicians try and make up for the fact they don't, their people don't have a very good standard of living by showing that they still have traditional Russian power over their neighbors. But that's sort of just to keep Putin and his crew in power. They are sort of disintegrating, that'll be more dangerous once that really starts happening. But at this point, their main danger to everyone else is going to be just propaganda and trying to screw around with other people's elections and all this kind of soft power stuff. Compared to China, who's actually going to be building up and coming military of the future with all their economic power. So public affairs is just basically trying to counter those messages when you're in other countries, and trying to maintain Canadian support for the military and funding it and the people and stuff, recruiting and whatnot when you're at home.
So do either of you want to just give a general overview of where the geopolitical situation reads in terms of the Navy, projection of power, ideology, influence? Like, what's the landscape look like to you guys?
just I guess the main lead for I think the main conflicts for the Navy as far as that they're involved with anything is sort of going to be the Americans protecting Taiwan. Um, will probably be the main place where you may see uh, water battles as China tries to expand and make fake islands and push out towards their neighbors. So it'll be sort of up to the Americans and their what is it 10 aircraft carriers to box in China, and I think that'll be the point for any hot flashes in the world.
Yeah, I would agree. Not just Taiwan, but yeah, the artificial islands, rectifying the breathtaking fuck up on the part of the last administration when it came to the Scarborough Shoals, which is the cause of all of our present difficulties with the Philippines at the moment. But yeah, the Spratlys, the Paracels, Scarborough, Taiwan, and then of course, can't forget the East China Sea with the Shinkaku/Diaoyu Islands. That whole spat between China and Japan, that's something that's next to Taiwan, probably the sensitive tripwire because Japan goes to war. I mean, we're right there with them. There's not even a pretense of trying to mediate that one.
Yeah, it's hard to tell how ready for a hot war Japan would be, but they've certainly gotten a little more ramped up in the last while, and their people are a little ever since World War II. Obviously, they went quite pacifist, but there's always been a group of hardliners who wanted to return to being the formidable military power they were, and with China kind of throwing its weight around, I think that's gonna keep increasing, and Japan might their quite strong economy might realize that they need to be ready for a fight with China, and especially with a slightly more isolationist U.S. government, that they may need to be ready to do it on their own, or at least be able to if they needed to.
Which I completely support. I mean, I follow Professor John Mearsheimer's offshore balancing model. Yeah, the way we're doing it now is probably not how I would conduct my way of, as you said earlier, boxing China in. I think there's a way more effective way of doing it. I think the British, of all people, actually showed us how that can be done. But we'll see. It's early days. We're just now pivoting to Asia, so I'm not going to be too critical. We still have major commitments in the Middle East. For some reason, we still feel like we have to be the Persian Gulf Police Department.
So can I ask you guys both a question from the Canadian and the American perspective? When I look at analytically, and just in terms of the curated news feed that I get, it says again and again, Trump hands Putin the Middle East on the silver platter. Trump hands Syria the Middle East, Trump hands Putin the middle of Syria on the silver platter. Trump, endless string of victories for Putin at the expense of Trump. So what do you guys both think from a Canadian naval perspective, public affairs, American naval perspective? Like, to what extent is Trump intentionally serving Putin? To what extent is Putin masterfully manipulating Trump? Like, why is there this continuous unity between what Putin wants and what Trump does?
I'll let the American take that one.
Oh, smoke break time. So it's because at the end of the day, American and Russian interests in the Middle East are not diametrically opposed. I mean, the United States has been trying and just eating shit at playing both sides of the fence thus far, but who are you really going to fight the Russians against ISIS or on the side of ISIS? I mean, and it's I don't know how far I should go into this because I know we have limited time. I don't really want to hog the mic with like the history of the Middle East going back to the 70s. But the point is, Russia has serious interest in the Middle East. Their only overseas base is a naval station in Syria. They've been friends with the Assad regime, I believe, since Hafez al-Assad. I think he had Soviet connections. So it's not just Russia, by the way. I mean, you've got to give it to the Iranians. They played a bad hand very well, um, very intelligently. But I don't see us handing the Middle East to the, not that it's ours to give them, first off, that's a whole different rant. It's just that Russia has effectively pursued its interests. And because of the ISIS problem, the United States has found itself, at least unofficially, on the same side as the Russians, which, if you're a Russophobe, that would look like Trump is capitulating to Putin. But just the hard headed reality of who is where and who needs what, and just the tactical, operational, and strategic interests in the region, especially with ISIS, although that's kind of a waning threat. Those two, the the two interests coincide, or at least the Russian interest was not so deleterious to the American one that Trump would need to do anything that would be antagonistic, let alone aggressive, against the Russians. I know we see them as diametrically opposed, and like Russia wants something, we must hate it. But in a place as messy as the Middle East, that's just not how it works all the time.
Yeah, that's pretty true. Like obviously Trump was sort of elected on getting out of the Middle East, and like you were saying, Russia has their one sea base there in Tartus in Syria, and like Syria is Russians base in that region. The Russians now are like the main thing the Americans have sort of been if you want to say they've been abandoning anyone to the Russians, it would be the Kurds, because the Russian special forces are now apparently they're fighting in northern Iraq against the Kurds, as well as also leaving the Turks to also slaughter the Kurds. So that's if there's been one like really black mark on Trump backing out, it's been the leaving the Kurds to the slaughter. But basically, the Americans, like back with FDR, that's when they made the deal with the Saudis that they would sort of protect the Saudis' dictatorship in exchange for the oil. But America's become much more fuel self-sufficient now. They're a major producer, and simply put, the Middle East is not as important to them. And like outside of protecting Israel, just because they're all the connections between the two countries, they don't really have a major reason to be there. Like they would like Iraq to hold together because they put so much resources into breaking it apart and then trying to keep it together afterwards. But ultimately, it's not hugely strategically valuable to the Americans, and they're kind of sick of the Middle East, hearing stories about spending money in the Middle East, looking at the $22 trillion they are in debt, and being like, why do we have to police the Middle East when it's unpoliceable, and all of our actions there have been possibly counterproductive, and now we're supporting ISIS to try and get rid of the dictators that support Russia. Like what are we doing? So it's not surprising that the Americans would not want to be spending a lot of blood and treasure anymore trying to maintain things there when they're not getting anything from it, and they're losing the ability to afford it.
That is true. I do like that you brought up the broader strategic point that it's not 1973 anymore, and really the Middle East just doesn't have the same global importance that it did. It's also interesting, and it kind of highlights what a messy place it is, that we sort of abandon our allies, the Turks, or the Kurds, to our allies, the Turks, who are a NATO member. So it's just like what either way you go, you're pissing somebody off that used to be your friend. And it's just I'll stop there because you said it pretty succinctly. It's not worth it, and it's perceived to not be worth it increasingly by us.
You also have this bizarre thing going on now in Libya, where you have Turkey is sending troops into Libya
to
support the UN-backed government in Tripoli there, and he's trying to block a general who's been fighting to try and control Libya, General Khalifa Haftar, who's trying to control Libya with the backing of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So you sort of have like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE fighting to support a general against the Turks and the UN, and it's like technically the Americans are on both sides of that. Um, so like it's just become this bizarre clusterfuck, and like the alliances are overlapping in a very bizarre way, and at some point you really aren't doing any good by being there, and you're not, at some point you got to kind of take care of yourself and focus on what's more strategically important for you in the future. So yeah, it's not surprising the Americans are doing this, and it'll be interesting to see if a Democrat does win the presidency, whether or not they just kind of continue this process, because it seems like the logical one.
So, what's life like in the naval service? So, both of you guys are quote unquote sailors. Is that what you call yourself?
Yeah, technically.
So, what's life like in the Navy for Canadian, for an American? So, let's start with Duros. What's life like? Like, what's the lifestyle?
Well, honestly, I'm a reservist, so my sailing experience has been limited to like one few week deployment type thing. Um, yeah, honestly, I don't love it. I'll be straight up. Sailing is kind of gross. It's it's you're stuck in cramped ships, and turns out I'm more claustrophobic than I figured. So like I'm happy doing the public affairs stuff back from the base now. But yeah,
What's that like though? Like, what's it like working off a base, family life, all that shit?
well, it's in a way it's more than a job, compared to most things. There's a lot more pomp and ceremony and outside events, and your military people are quite your family, because most people don't have the same uh, lifestyles as that, and the same kind of like value system and whatnot. Um, the community is probably more conservative than you'd find on average, just because those are the type of people who join the military. Um, I'm a reservist, so I don't have to deal with getting moved around, arbitrarily by the forces, which I think puts a lot of strain on a lot of naval, a lot of military families. They basically say anyone who's captains a ship has probably had 2 to 3 divorces, just because it's puts such a strain being away for months and months and months away from your family, that most people can't make it work unless either they're both they're a military couple, or the one just like stays at home with the children, and they figured out a way to make that work. But yeah, for the people who do the real sailing, it's a high stress um, lifestyle that does reduce your freedom quite a bit. But at the same time, they get to travel, go travel the Mediterranean, and go, suddenly you're on security duty in South Korea for some event, and suddenly you're searching for drug smugglers up and down the west coast of South America, and so there's a lot of positives to it as well. Plus, good benefits and pension. Um, so yeah,
So,
overall,
if it's okay to ask, how is it being a new father with also being a reservist officer? Is it difficult, easy?
well, I've reduced the amount I'm in right now for sure. They're pretty good about that in Canada with getting time off to go, raise your spawn, and so they've been pretty understanding of me being there less. Public affairs is something you can do fairly easily, from your own home and things like that. A lot of it's social media, or writing stories, or editing, and just following media to keep track of stories to past your commanding officers and whatnot. So um, it's been pretty manageable, but I suspect for most other like hard seagoing trades and things like that, it would be a lot more difficult, and either they'd just to take all the time off, or they'd um, not be with their kid and have the spouse do it.
NSA, if you want to jump in on this interview, feel free. Do you have any questions for Canadian Naval Public Affairs, NSA?
Oh yeah, I just got back. So in regards to the Nimitz reports and all the stuff we got going on, have you guys had any of that stuff going on? I did read the Canadian UFO releases not too long ago. They had a bunch of reports that were released in the last few years.
Honestly, that's a good question. I have not really been following Canada's release on discussion on that type of stuff. I mean, our old defense minister talked a lot about that. He was kind of a crazy person, but he was He basically said the Americans had full knowledge of UFOs, and that they needed to hand over the technology to the world because it was destabilizing. But as far as being public affairs, I haven't been given any interesting information regarding UFOs or things we're supposed to say to people about UFOs.
Really? You haven't even been briefed on like how to say it to the public type stuff? Because you probably get questions all the time as a result of the US doing the discussions on it, right?
Yeah, honestly, maybe they do come in with Canada. Mostly the files would be handed over to someone in Ottawa. So maybe there is someone over in Ottawa whose job is the UFO file, and just any queries get tossed over to them. I'm not familiar with the process at all, unfortunately.
All right, I don't want to be a.
Seems like I would get more just considering where I live, but yeah.
You were referencing Paul Hellyer, right?
Yeah, there you go.
So your experience is public affairs in relation to intelligence, right? Did you have any other position? Or did you work anything else other than public affairs?
No, I came straight in as public affairs officer.
How much do you guys, being Canadian, work with the ONI or the DIA here in the U.S.?
Honestly, being in the reserves, I'm not familiar exactly how much. I imagine there'd be a bit, but the reservists don't really at all. Yeah. Yeah, so not the most interesting answer, but yeah, some of the stuff it just never comes up for the reserve, so I couldn't tell you.
So how about this? What would you be able to tell us without violating any confidentiality or whatever? Just about like what is the portfolio you've been given? What is the land map of this geopolitical situation that you're able to tell?
What's on Google you can say.
Sorry?
I was gonna say what's on Google you can say. What's been said is said. Hasn't been said can't be said.
Yeah, that is more or less it. As far as working out the reserve, we like honestly reserves in Canada. The main thing is it's like a recruiting method, right? You come in, people work through the reserves, and a lot of them wind up going to the reg force. Other than that, it's mostly just public relations. You're sort of the connections between the Navy and the citizens who live around the Navy. So honestly, I'm not going to pretend our job is super interesting that way as far as, reporting on Chinese actions or Russian actions or anything like that. Occasionally something will come up where like a Russian submarine will come near the coast and just like, but honestly, most of that stuff gets passed off to the reg force. Where I live, there's a reg force naval base nearby, so they wind up kind of handling all the major stuff, and the reserves do. We do some training with them, and we can join on ships with them and go sailing with them. But for the most part, the major files get handled by the reg force Navy.
So is there a talking point set you're given? Is there points you're supposed to hit in terms of the public message? Like, are you given a message?
Yeah, like we have key messaging, as would any public affairs branch for any like company or government or whatever. You have the messages that the command team it wants to pass down to the public. Generally, we'll write it up for them. They'll review it and assume and confirm if that's what they want to say on any topic. Like we had an interesting one just working with the gay pride parade. It was something we'd never done in the city, and the gay pride parade had gotten into a fight basically with the local police. They didn't want them to join in, and they didn't want them to be there in uniform, just due to, I guess, poor relations between police and the gay community. So we just had to deal with trying to see as well. Would you want the sailors to be there? You got the YMCA thing going with the village people with the sweet white uniforms. So it's like we fit in pretty good, and it was just trying to coordinate with them to see if they would let us, and eventually they did, and it was considered a victory because Canada is very big on the diversity, the gender-based analysis stuff, all of that here. So mostly the type of stuff I'm dealing with is in relation to the public in the city I live.
Okay, so you don't do like full-on military. Okay, well, I was going to ask a question, but it might not. Have you been discussed or briefed on any of the advancements in weaponry being tested on as far as electromagnetic weapons go? because I know that a large portion of the population is reporting symptoms from China to America, et cetera, that they're being, quote, tested on by military units.
Can't say I've got any messaging or any special information on that. Hopefully that's not happening, but possible. Canada wouldn't be at the lead of that anyway. We get the leftovers. Half of our ships are like 40 years old and whatnot. So we're
well, this is more like national security reasons in the cities and stuff. But anyway, go on, Chuck.
Well, I'm just wondering, what about in terms of climate change, the Arctic passages, the northern ice melting? Are they telling you anything about what this will change in terms of, Russia, different geopolitical conflicts? Is there going to be a trade route? Is it going to be an invasion because of melted ice routes? Like, do they say anything about this?
There is more focus on that for sure, and there is more discussion with the Canadian military about how we will handle the melting ice and the fact that basically ships will be able to go through there year round and not too long. In some places they probably already can, and the fact that we will see more pushback by the Russians and also the Chinese with their calling themselves a near Arctic country. So yeah, there's kind of the collection of the Arctic Circle countries and coordination between them to make sure that there is some international law observed up there. And there's just a lot of messaging pushing. There was under the Harper government in Canada, and Trudeau did during his first term a bit anyway, try and say that Canada is an Arctic country and we got to defend our north, and that we're going to be making substantial investments into new icebreakers and that type of thing. So
I was just gonna. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. I thought you were done. I was gonna.
No, you go.
So I just watched something on CSIS, which is a think tank for the Army. They do the Coast Guard of the United States has a couple icebreakers, and they're building one more. China has one, and a couple other countries have some because they're kind of making a rush for up there. Are you guys building up? You just mentioned icebreakers, which is what I was about to ask. So.
Yeah, we have a couple, and we do have a couple that we've been tendering out. I don't know if we've made I think we have 2 that we finalized the deal on, and then there are supposed to be some more coming down. So
is that
Canada can't afford a huge navy, so we probably should have more relative to the amount of coast we have up there, but we afford what we afford.
So do you have an equivalent to Coast Guard in the Navy, or is that basically the same thing for you guys? Because we have different, we sanction it out different.
Yeah. Canada does have a Coast Guard. It's actually right next to the base I go to. They're pretty close together. Basically, they don't count as militaries. They're technically a civilian organization here, unlike in the States. Although I think we convinced Trump to let us count it towards our 2% spending limit under NATO. So we do have a Coast Guard. They practice various maneuvers with us and things like emergency response for when the West Coast eventually gets hit by like a big earthquake and a big tsunami type thing. So we have one of them.
Okay, because our guy is Carl Schultz.
So what would you say is the prospect for war? Are we going to have peace for the next 10 years? Is there going to be war in 5? Like, is there going to be conflict? Is there going to be an increase in tranquility? What do you think, both you guys, any of you guys?
I'll let you have someone else take that one.
Are we on a course towards more conflict or less conflict? Nobody's got an opinion?
Personally, I don't see any reason conflict's gonna suddenly emerge. I mean, a lot of countries have gone a little bit more nationalist, and you are getting some more right-wing politicians popping up all over the place, which usually is sort of a potential trigger for war. You have Modi in India. What was it, Bolsonaro? How do you say his name in Brazil? Hungary. You got Oban. So there is a lot of countries sort of turning more aggressive and more xenophobic, and closing their borders a bit, which will be a problem climate change really does create a whole bunch of refugees, and that could be destabilizing. If there's going to be conflicts, it'll probably be based around climate change causing famines and that type of thing, which can destabilize government. But overall, between the major players anyway, I don't think that there's any major triggers. Nobody really wants a large-scale war. Basically every government knows that would probably result in them getting tossed. China, yeah.
Sorry. Here's a question. So my understanding is Canada identifies Russia as being its main geostrategic adversary. Do you think there's any actual reason why Russia and Canada should be geostrategic adversaries? Like, are their interests actually at variance with each other? Or is this just an unnecessary thing?
I would say, obviously there's conflict over the Arctic is kind of the main flashpoint between the two of us. But there's no real reason besides the fact that Canada is sort of tied to the hip with the United States. So, if U.S. winds up in any kind of a hot war of any kind with Russia, then we will definitely be dragged into it kind of no matter what. That's the U.S. sort of is our defense mechanism. So if the defense mechanism fights Russia, then we fight Russia. There's also is the worry that Russia could move over on Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, and there are NATO countries positioned in the NATO troops positioned in those countries that are basically tripwire troops, meaning they couldn't actually stop Russia at all. But the point is that Russia would be triggering war with NATO by running over them. So it's unlikely Russia would do that. Russia does not want war with NATO. Russia is desperate to slowly kind of break down NATO, which is sort of why people say he supported Trump to begin with, as a Trump sort of anti-NATO language. He's also tried to pull Germany away from NATO and make them reliant on Russian fuel, and sort of just make it so Germany would never agree to conflict with Russia. But overall, Russia will sort of pickle around the edges. They're quite good at being efficient with a low budget and without going into direct conflict, because they couldn't actually win that. So assuming there isn't some big miss trip where somebody really screws up and drags everybody into it, I don't think anybody actually wants it.
Do you have any sea-based X-band radar fucking floaters? The big old.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
Any of those? I linked in the chat what they were. I know the U.S. Navy has some of that stuff.
Who has the upper hand, Russia or the U.S.? Is that a real question? I mean, obviously, there's going to be a variant on a significant variant on different sectors of that, but yeah.
Because who was it? There was
The U.S. has the upper hand, obviously.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, but again, there's going to be Putin lovers that say he's going to destroy us with his make believe ballistic missiles.
Oh, the scramjet ones. Yeah, you guys have. You're at the hip with NORAD, right? So you work a lot with missile defense for the North American region. But that's more. That wouldn't be Navy, would it?
Canada has the CNR, which is the Aerospace Intelligence Identification and Control Region for Canada.
Yeah, Navy doesn't work with that too much. That'd be Air Force.
Yeah, they're based up in Winnipeg, if I recall right.
Are orcas a threat to national security? Are very mind-controlled orcas?
I have a question.
What do you? Go ahead.
For the Navy SEALs, for any guys who knows maybe the answer. So now the president of France is investing in hundreds of millions of dollars in language schools in Africa to teach French. And his plan in the future is to educate and make the people in Africa, in many places in Africa, their male language is to be the French language, so that they can kind of influence them politically and get interest of them and somehow get control of the region. Is this something the other countries are considering to discuss or talk about?
Who is doing this?
Can you elaborate more specifically?
Like the president of France, I don't know what his name exactly.
No,
He
but
wants
this
to-
doesn't have anything to do with this conversation. It really doesn't.
Emmanuel Macron.
I mean,
As far as I can tell.
Francois
That's
Freak
because
is a
of
fascinating
neocolonialism.
geopolitical topic, which I'm all for, but I don't know if we want to get into that.
No, I don't think that's relevant, Zinman. That's not really what we're talking. We got a Canadian Navy guy. We got an American Navy guy. We don't need to talk about France. It's outside of the
I've got one.
scope of this.
I've got one. Do you guys do defense and monitoring of the internet taps that go through the ocean? Do you ever?
Not as far as I know.
That's one of those things where if we did, we would not tell you.
Well, there's basically a giant wire running from here to China.
Yeah, seems like a logical thing to do,
Yeah,
really.
no comment on that.
As to your orca question, wasn't it not too long ago that they found a dolphin that looked like it had Russian
Military
Russian,
whales,
equipment stuck
yeah.
to it? Yeah.
There's actually military whales. Yeah, Russian military whales. And then they also have military dolphins.
And by the way, NSA, that's U.S. Navy who monitors that.
Okay. Well,
So how about this question for Duros? What do you feel like is Trudeau's political position? Is it stable? Is it improving? Is it decreasing? How is his political hegemony going here in terms of Justin Trudeau?
Like
And how's he
within Canada?
within Canada, internationally, and how's he perceived in the military?
Well, he's not perceived great in the military. Partially because of his dad did big cuts. When I was going through basic training, we called them when we didn't have blanks to practice with. Like when we were going through basic, they'd call them Trudeau rounds, and they go budget cuts, and so they're not very beloved generally. In Canada, he's he lost a fair number of seats, lost his majority government, and now a big chunk of the western part of the country wants to separate. I mean, they sort of always have, but now they've
Come on home.
yeah, basically it's and
We'll take you.
Yeah, I know, and that's sort of what Alberta is planning to do, is just join the U.S. and see if they'll take them as another state. So overall, Trudeau's lost a lot. He's trying to be a lot more serious and a lot less kind of fluffy and dancy and showy. He seems to have lost a lot of credibility with the other major world politicians just by being kind of flaky and not a very serious seeming person. There are some big problems with the Liberal Party and China, in that the Liberals, especially Jean Chrétien, the previous prime minister, were kind of major early investors in we'll fix China by doing trade with them and open them up, and that'll make them more liberal and more like us. And then it didn't sort of happen that way. So now you have Joe Biden's son, who's invested in the U.S. Joe Biden's son invested in companies in China that spot, like the surveillance companies that monitor faces for their police state, and you have some Canadians kind of involved in similar shady stuff with the Chinese government that's sort of made it hard to take China on, even when they kidnap our two businessmen and just hold them hostage indefinitely. So Canada under the Liberals is sort of a weak player in regards to China. I don't know if that answered the question, but it was some words.
No, it's great. I mean, what do you think is Canada's position? Are we in a good position? Are we in a bad position? How's our future looking?
Overall, our failure to be able to get out any kind of pipelines to be able to sell our oil sands. Oil has been kind of weakening us for quite a while. We've become a very soft country, is sort of my opinion. We have very strong social services that we are not really paying for, or and I think it's 25% of our GDP now is tied up in our housing market. So basically buying and building and constructing houses that we then sell to each other. which is, I think, unheard of. I think they said that that is the highest any country's ever been, for having a part of their market just be, unproductive internal selling to each other. So overall, I think we're looking at a pretty tough bit of a future. Trudeau's racking up a lot of debt without a lot to show for it. And yeah, I think there's a fair amount of argument that a lot of the green movement against climate change in Canada was actually sponsored by American interests while they were fracking to kind of make Canada turn off our own resource sector. Which if that was the plan, then it actually worked really well and was pretty clever.
Very interesting. So, what do you think about the whole Space Force thing? The fact that there's now like Chinese Space Force, American Space Force, Israeli Space Force, UK Space Force. Like, what is this going to look like? What does this matter? Do you have any idea about space war? I know it's a jump from the oceans to the fucking sky, but it's a new branch of the military.
I got no ideas on
No
Space
ideas.
Force, so I'll let someone else take that.
No, that's a fair point. I mean, I don't know if anybody does, but I know it's all about defending satellites and attacking satellites, and they got a secret space plane. They do secret missions, but we won't get into that. That's another subject. How about you, Surprise? Are there any other key naval issues here that you might know about that we don't?
See, I was gone for a minute, so I'm not sure what all you guys covered.
I'm just wondering, is there anything on the horizon? Is there anything on the radar that's of importance that people in the Navy are aware of? Is there any Godzillas, Kaijus, huge sea monsters on the radar? Is there colossal monsters that are going to climb out and destroy New York?
As long as they land in China first. No, I mean there's the whole island thing. I mean, there's nothing I could say that in broad outline that isn't classified that would be new information. I mean, we could go into more detail on anti-ship ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles in general,
the Aegis system
building program. But
so, what's the deal with hypersonic missiles, and what does it matter that Putin has them and America doesn't yet? Is that significant?
It's significant in just the basic arms race arithmetic. When that's something you want, we're obviously working very hard to catch up. I mean, it does kind of throw missile defense back quite a bit because you really can't shoot these. Not that it was ever easy to begin with. It was always a process of trying to shoot down a bullet with another bullet, but
yeah, I watched the CSIS on the defense system. We have the THAAD, the Aegis, a couple other ones that have all types of range of missiles for these things, set up all around the what is it called, the Asian Ocean, that area. What's that? I forget what it's called for the Army or Navy.
Yeah, I mean,
East Asia Pacific.
I can say it's a game changer, but I mean, it's a significant new development, and especially as far as anti-ship ballistic missiles go, it's not a. It's unfortunate. That's about as sounds glib, but that's about as far as I'll go in on it.
I have one question for you. I was watching that carrier documentary series. Canada doesn't have any aircraft carriers. Like, our ships don't get that crazily big. But how familiar are you with like the idea of like gangs on aircraft carriers, and the idea like the commanding officers have to walk around with like a bodyguard team, because you just wind up with that many people, and some of them probably being pretty rough people before they join the military.
Oh, well, I don't do anything like that. However, my cousin was on an aircraft carrier, or was obviously not on one for 4 years, but did his full active duty and went on several tours. And I was asking him about that, and he expressed some astonishment when I brought that to his attention. It's a military vessel. It's not like the old school. Just take any rough you can, and if you do, you hope there's not a mutiny. He doesn't remember any of commanding officers having to, have bodyguards or be worried about anything like that. The discipline was pretty tight where he was, and that's the only firsthand knowledge that I can relate on that. I have not been deployed on a ship yet, although that probably changes by the end of this year.
Yeah, it always seemed like the idea that the aircraft carriers were some kind of like criminal gangland from like Judge Dredd always seemed a little far fetched. So I'm wondering if they just had one good example of where there was, something crazy like gangs fighting or something, or like gang members who joined. Because they do talk about gang members who do join the military in order to get the training. But yeah, it all seemed like a bit of a stretch.
Yeah,
Well,
no, like just in a broader sense, yeah, no, that would get shut down immediately. I mean, that's captain's mast minimum.
Well, they do have 5,000 members on a aircraft carrier, so I mean, cliques and clubs would form, I would assume, in natural.
Cliques and clubs form from RTC on, but as far as like fist fights and shit, that you don't see that. Certainly not in a gang warfare sense. I mean, that's just not. That is not what's done.
I think he's thinking of something like American Gangster, where they're in Vietnam, they would oversee ship all the drugs type stuff.
Yeah, people fragging their officers and everything. Like, no, it's not. It is.
So, do either of you guys want to touch on what you think the whole Iran situation was about, and what the simplification or implication of that might be? Like, is there going to be any further fallout from the Iran thing? Is it over now? Does it involve the navies?
It seems like the situation is calming down, although not actually in Iran. Like they're dealing with, massive protests, and it seems like Iran is kind of flailing around. Like a lot of the problems in the whole Middle East do kind of stem from Iran. You have the Houthis in Yemen. You have Hezbollah and Hamas are kind of mostly Iranian funded. And it seems like more of the stable countries are kind of the Sunni dictatorships in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and whatnot. So I can't blame the Iranians for kind of using what resources they have to defend themselves as the minority religion group. But I don't know. It seems like a lot of the countries where they're involved are kind of the more conflict filled ones right now. I don't know if that means anything, or if it's if just everyone else is getting enough support to kind of stabilize their people.
Well, you have an opportunity here to get your message out, whatever it may be, to whoever may listen to this podcast, a few hundred people at least, maybe a few thousand. So is there anything on your mind that you want to get out there? Anything you think that people need to know on any level?
Be nice to your neighbors.
Be nice to your neighbors. Does that include national neighbors, international neighbors?
Just everyone. Join the Navy when you're young, and like in the reserve, and they can pay for you to go through school, and then become a diver, because that seems like a really sweet trade. And if I could have done things again, that's how I would have done it. Because they just get paid to like learn to dive and like stay in wicked shape, and it'll pay your way through school, and then you can go do whatever you want with the rest of your life if you don't like the Navy. But yeah, I'd recommend that.
So here's a question for you. What is your take on Paul Hellyer? You think he's legit with all his talk of meeting aliens and secret space programs? You think he went crazy? You think he's a troll? Like, what's the deal with him?
I haven't found a lot of people agreeing with him. It's possible he's crazy. It's possible he really did get access to all this, but there's not a lot backing up the stuff he said. Although, like his whole biography makes him seem like a pretty credible person, so it'd be weird if it was all, drawn from whole cloth, but he's honestly, I don't know what to believe. He's one of those people that can think about. I can sort of compartmentalize in different parts of my mind and he could be crazy, he could be straight up legit, and I can plan the rest of my life with either of those being true.
Yeah, because like his track record is pretty profound. Like he turned around the whole Canadian Army, brought them all in the like together and stuff like that. I was reading through it the other day.
Yeah, he's not a nothing person. He's like he was So it's either he's just the only honest person who doesn't mind like really screwing up his career by saying all the stuff that makes him sound nuts, or he is nuts, or he's either a hero or he's nuts.
Well, I have read some of his stuff on like Reddit AMAs and some other things that he's done, and his discussions and conversations. He's done some stuff on RT, a couple other news forums. He discusses kind of like how Greer does this non-locality the secret to the universe is consciousness and all this other stuff. So he gets a little new agey hippie on it, and I think that's because the interaction with these beings, they have a type of mind reading technology to analyze consciousness the way that we can't really extrapolate to the public, and I think he most people who seem to be contactees or at least involved in it seem to be a little woo-woo about it because they're not wrapping their heads around the situation technically.
Oh, wait, this is something interesting, Duros. Can you recount the story of the UFO encounter that you and your sister had when you guys were kids in the cabin? You remember what I'm talking about?
I do feel that I interacted with a UFO. Well, at least saw one. Back at our cabin when we were little, and it was just woke up in the middle of the night to see this kind of glowing ball moving across the field. That was the one I had. It wasn't too much, but then there was also my cousins who were out at the cabin too, and they a different time, like the place had quite a history of UFOs. There was people would see them in the sky, and then the whole community of people around the lake used to meet up to have discussions at the train tracks just about road maintenance and having the occasional little get together, and people talk that one about seeing UFO like lights flying across and then seeing a bunch of black helicopters suddenly flying across the sky a few minutes later. And then my own cousins they were in a smaller kind of attachment cottage, and they basically woke up to this crazy orange light coming into the cabin, shaking the whole thing. The dog freaked out and then suddenly went silent, and a glass lamp fell off the table and didn't break. And none of them wanted to talk about it. Like one of them sort of mentioned it later, and then one of them, if you ever tried to bring it up with her, was clearly just like shooken the hell up and did not want to discuss it. So that always stuck with me. So I'm a believer that they're there, but I'm not sure what to make of it.
Is there any other supernatural, paranormal, alien type shit you've encountered either in the military or outside of it?
Me? No.
No. Do you think we'll make it to another planet in this lifetime? Mars, the moon? Will there be any meaningful off-planet presence?
Honestly, hard to predict. If there is, it'll probably be the work of some crazy rogue billionaire who just decides to make that his goal. There's not really too much reason for like governments to do that kind of investment compared to trying to clean up our mess here, because Mars is not very habitable.
Hey, my bad for jumping in. This is kind of a little bit off to the side a bit. A quick millisecond idea. Does anyone have a Roblox account that they could give to me? I apologize.
Ignore that. So, let's see. Surprise, Mr. Duros, NSA. Does anyone have any further questions?
I mean, I got tons. I just don't know how they would fully apply to the Navy side of things. Are you aware of any type of weather manipulation? The U.S. Navy has been doing weather modification research for about 100 years on paper. HARP was designed and utilized up in Alaska. They have mobile HARP units that can, on our Navy ships that can alter the jet streams and stuff like that by blasting radio waves at the ionosphere. Are you aware of anything like that?
No.
Well, I know you aren't surprised.
Yeah, I can't say I am either. I hope we do have that ability. It'd be very interesting. But yeah, I'm if the Americans might have it, Canada won't.
You think there's any undersea bases like Sea Lab 2021? Remember we used to watch that show, Sea Lab?
It was a great show. That's a good question. Again, if anyone had it, would be the Americans.
Did you see the thing about the WikiLeaks that said there was an American base on the moon that was destroyed by the Russians? Did you ever see about that?
I think I remember you telling me about it. I don't think I saw anything else.
I mean, it's literally
explaining that.
just a document on WikiLeaks, but it is on WikiLeaks' own website, and it just says there was a U.S. base on the moon and Russia destroyed it, and that's basically all it says. But for whatever reason, it's on the WikiLeaks with everything else. So
Yeah,
it's
there were a lot of
interesting.
communications between a man named Edgar Mitchell, who was a sixth man on the moon, and a company called Quantrek in the Hillary release emails, in communication with John Podesta about the UFO scenario and a lot of things going on Earth. I don't know if that was part of it, but that's one thing to search for if you want to check that out on WikiLeaks.
Yeah,
Well-
that might be the place to look for it then.
Could I cut in for a second? Because I'd like to just ask a quick question of someone in the room.
Go ahead.
Cliff Rockefeller. Are you the Cliff Rockefeller with the Alan Watts channel?
Correct.
Dude, you are the man. You
That's
are
a derail,
the
buddy.
man.
Thanks, sir. Thanks for that. So, I guess this has been really interesting. We covered quite a lot. Is there anything more you want to get out? Is there any more that anyone wants to ask? Well, that being the case, I'd say that was really interesting. Thanks very much to Surprise, to Duros, and everybody else for coming out. Was there any questions before we wrap up? Maybe that came through the text channel or through Rhodesian? Let me take a quick look. No, looks like that's it. All right. So thank you very much, Duros. Hopefully you can make time to come back again sometime. Hang out here on the server anytime you want. Thank you, everybody, for attending the live recording. If you enjoyed this, check out the Roundtable Discord server. Search Conspiracy. You'll find the Roundtable there. And until then, we'll do another episode soon. Thanks, everybody, and take care.